This is the ASHRAE Leadership Recall interview for Andy Persily, the Vice President from 2007 to 2009. My name's Tim Dwyer, I'm from the ASHRAE Historical Committee, and this has been recorded at the ASHRAE Summer Conference in Denver, Colorado, June 25th, 2013. Andy, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your growing up in Chicago.
I'd be happy to. I grew up, as you said, in Chicago on the south side of the city, which was pretty much a working class neighborhood. Attended public schools, and it was kind of the baby boom era when there were a lot of middle class communities were built, to house the new generation of young families, and had two older brothers, a younger sister. My father was a printer. I think he was really an engineer at heart, but he didn't have the opportunity to pursue the education. But I didn't realize it till later that he was really, very hands-on, and he wanted to teach. He wanted to make sure I understood a trade, because he thought that was very important. So he taught me how to do hot lead type, which became an obsolete technology about 3 or 4 years after he taught me.
Okay, and as part of your education, did you go to a private or public school in Chicago?
I went to a public elementary school and high school, where I always liked math and science. I just liked the consistency, and there were generally definitive answers, and I really enjoyed that. And then moved on to college, went to a small liberal arts college, which didn't have engineering, where I did physics and mathematics, and got a teaching certificate for kindergarten through high school, which I never used. But I was very interested in pursuing education at that time, and never thought about it till now, but in some sense, my ASHRAE activities, are to a large degree educational, and so I never pursued an educational career formally. I think in terms of ASHRAE, I did do a lot of education work. And you had those interests at that stage, but then you moved into higher education and university. And where did you spend that time? Yeah, well, when I finished college and decided I didn't want to do teaching of young children because I didn't feel capable of it, and I studied physics and math, I didn't feel like I knew anything that was useful to anybody. I could do homework and take tests and prove mathematical theorems, but I didn't think I could get a job doing that. And I think if all else hadn't transpired differently, I might have gone to graduate school to study theoretical mathematics, but that didn't seem very important to the problems the world was facing. And in the late 70s, there was a lot of, energy issues started to become more important as prices increased, and environmental concerns. So I thought, well, I should go do something in engineering and applied science. So I took a year off after college and pursued applications to graduate school in engineering and applied science programs. And I went to Princeton University, where they had the Center for Environmental Studies, which became the Center for Energy and Environmental Studies, and they were doing home, energy studies, retrofits, trying to understand why homes were using so much energy and how they could use less energy. I was there when the first blower door in North America was designed and built, which was used to pressure test buildings, and I got a great appreciation for how important it is to actually test buildings. Design is good, but without going to the buildings and making measurements, that's really where you really learn something.
And still maintaining very much an academic background throughout the early years.
While I was in graduate school, it was academic, but I was in a mechanical and aerospace engineering department where they were doing supersonic airfoils and lasers and combustion, flame spread, and I was doing residential energy consumption.
So I did not fit in very well with the kind of the hardcore, high-tech engineers. So certainly an academic environment, but a very, practical research focus.
And did that involve field work, going out to houses?
Yeah, we were measuring air tightness in houses. I had a little hut on the roof of our building where I was measuring infiltration rates and energy consumption, and but most of the work was done in the lab, or on this hut on the roof, or in some of the homes in the area that we were doing energy studies in.
And is that where you stayed, or did you move on from there?
I finished there in I think 4.5 years or something, and I was at an energy conference, probably a very early energy conference in the grand series of such conferences that have since taken place, and I bumped into someone from the National Bureau of Standards, whose name was Press McNall, who I think subsequent to that became a vice president of ASHRAE. And he told me, oh, you're finishing your PhD. We have a postdoc program. And that sounded like a good idea. So I applied and was accepted to this postdoctoral research associate program and at the National Bureau of Standards in the early 80s.
So that's in your late 20s then, you would have been then?
Yeah.
And as an engineer in your late 20s, what were challenges you saw in industry at that time?
Yeah, well, I wasn't that, really exposed to industry. I was, again, we were looking at in graduate school, I was looking mostly at homes and the issue of air tightness and energy consumption and how to modify or retrofit a home so it would use less energy. So I really wasn't that connected to the industry side. But I appreciated from my colleagues at this research center the whole issues of energy cost and the policy concerns about different fuel types and environmental impacts, and it was a very interdisciplinary group. So there were people doing nuclear policy and non-proliferation and nuclear power safety, people doing research on coal as a fuel and as environmental issues, and psychologists trying to understand why you put insulation in your attic and I wouldn't put it in mine. So it was a really good exposure to the fundamentally interdisciplinary nature of energy use in buildings.
And so I guess that really gave you an interest in the connection between perhaps building intent and the actual building use.
Right. I quickly gained a real appreciation for again, as I said earlier, for the importance of measurement and measuring building performance and then relating it to the design intent, the standard or code that it should have been complying with.
Interesting, of course, those areas are areas that ASHRAE has expanded into since those years.
Sure.
And of course, when you're in your late 20s, you weren't actually actively involved in ASHRAE.
No, I'm not as a member. There wasn't a student branch where I was. There were, other researchers who were participating in ASHRAE. So I started to see these big orange books, these transactions with papers that I needed to read, and subsequently met the people who wrote them. This was before I could, get the articles online. So when I needed an ASHRAE transaction article that might have been a little old and wasn't in our library, I went to the engineering library in New York City, which was about an hour train ride, which was the building where ASHRAE was located before I moved to Atlanta, just kind of across the street from the United Nations. So, little did I know that I was kind of starting a relationship with the organization that was going to develop quite a bit in the years to follow.
So, as with many people, you started as a consumer of ASHRAE information.
True.
And how did that develop into you actually contributing to the ASHRAE information?
Well, shortly after I graduated and started the postdoc, when you get your PhD, you try to turn your thesis chapters into publications. So I had one such chapter was converted to a publication that I went to an ASHRAE meeting in Toronto, I think in '82, June of 1982, to present it. And I went with my then supervisor, or research advisor was the title when I was a postdoc, who, dragged me to sessions and technical committee meetings, and he was at the table. I wasn't at the table yet, but, when they needed somebody to write a work statement for a research project or to review something, he would go, "Oh yeah, Andy can do that." And I learned the joys of volunteering or being volunteered.
So that was a positive introduction into ASHRAE.
It was. I mean, starting to meet people and realizing I can contribute, and people I had heard about or read their papers, and it was a little intimidating at first, but I didn't let it bother me too much because they seemed to know so much more than I did.
And possibly areas that you thought weren't actually industrially based would have great influence in terms of the development of ASHRAE.
Yeah, I think I had no sense of the bigger picture. I did not know, when I went, I didn't know there was a president and a board. There were these people, and one night, every meeting, they got all dressed up in tuxedos, and I'm like, who are these guys? What are they doing? Because I was going out with my friends very informally, who I knew as research colleagues from technical committees, and it was just a very, I didn't know this bigger world existed.
So at that stage, you wouldn't have any knowledge of the so-called grassroots committees in ASHRAE?
Not at all. I didn't know there were chapters, and I didn't, know that side of the society until much later.
Andy, but the term grassroots is used in ASHRAE to talk about some of the committees that really underpin the activities of ASHRAE. Were those committees that you were involved in early on?
Not early on. I wasn't aware of that side. I was active in the technical committees and then some standards committees. I really wasn't aware that there were these chapter meetings, and if I was, I'm not sure, why I would have gone, because they might have been talking about how to design chilled water systems, which I wasn't doing. Later on, I got a better appreciation for that side of the society. I'm a researcher, and research can be a lot of fun, to learn new things and write papers and go to conferences. But fundamentally, you do research, I think, you should do research to solve real problems. And I've always, as I started going to chapter meetings and speaking at chapter dinners, to learn the real problems that practitioners are facing has been very useful to me as a researcher and as a member of the society, because, if we're going to develop a standard, we want people to be able to use it, and we need to understand the world in which they work on a day-to-day basis. So, I got a much better appreciation later on.
You got further involved in ASHRAE through such things as the handbook, and I think you were involved in rewriting elements of that.
When I was on TC 4.3, I rewrote the chapter on infiltration and ventilation in 1989. And that was a lot of work, and didn't realize what I had volunteered for, but that was a good experience. And I became more and more active in that technical committee. Eventually, I chaired it. Eventually, I found out that a chair's tenure was only supposed to last 3 years. So, and I had exceeded that, so I got the opportunity to stop chairing it. And I moved on into a couple of different standards committees, started going to other technical committees. I think the big change for me was the getting involved in Environmental Health Committee and Standard 62.1.
Which standard is that one?
Standard 62.1 is the ventilation for acceptable indoor air quality, first published in 73, I'm sorry. And there had been a big revision of the standard in 1989 that was very controversial for a number of reasons, and ASHRAE realized that they better start the next revision right away. And so a new committee was formed in 1992, and I participated in that for a number of years, and several years later I chaired it, was chairing it for a 4-year term. And I think I was started out as a non-voting member, feeling a little green, and not totally comfortable, and some very tough issues, came before the committee, and I was like, gosh, I'm sure glad I don't have to vote, because I don't know what I would do. But you grow, and you learn how to partake of the debate and listen to the debate and form opinions. And later on, on that committee, and sometimes on the board, when the vote would finally be taken, and they would say all in favor, raise your hand, I would look down and raise my hand so I didn't see what other people were doing. And sometimes I was the only one who voted yes, but you're there to offer your opinion, and that's what you're supposed to do. So,
and of course, as chair of a fairly important committee, you had responsibilities.
Oh yeah, it was.
What did being a chairman actually entail? How did you have to change your role in the activity of that committee?
Right. I mean, it was a real learning experience. As a member, I could really argue from my perspective, but as a chair, you need to step back, and you're about making sure the process moves forward and not arguing for your opinion, but making sure people, other people's opinions were expressed. It's making sure that other people had an opportunity to express their opinion, and getting an appreciation, that we've heard from that talkative person for the last half an hour. I know that person has some worthwhile things to say, and trying to draw them out. And while another thing that I would do is, the debate's going this way, but Tim isn't in the room, and I know if Tim was there, he would say something different, and I don't want to offer that opinion, but we're going to have problems later on with Tim if somebody doesn't say, so as chair I would say, I know if Tim was here, he would say this. So let's talk about that perspective, because we need to hear from everybody. And I it's really a balance as chair. You want to give everybody, the opportunity to speak their mind, but you also have to get things moving. So there's a balance to be struck between, inclusiveness and talking to death every issue, but making a decision. And once those, that debate has really run its course, helping the committee actually go one way or the other. And that committee, there was a lot of controversy with a number of different areas that could be somewhat delicate at times. And I 5 years before I did that, I couldn't imagine how I would handle it, but I handled it one way or another. And that's when I started to get involved more with the chapters, because I was invited as 62.1 chair to give talks on the standards.
And was that, and did that really show you a different side of ASHRAE once you went out to the chapters and put forward the case that you've been making with your committee 62.1?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, for me, it was an opportunity to talk to them about what we were doing and why, and to hearing from them, what their challenges were, because there were a lot of people who had negative opinions about how the standard was being revised, but not all of those opinions were based on fact. So it was an opportunity. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. If you've got a better idea, speak up. We want to hear. And that was, I think, yes, it was in some sense a public relations effort, but it was also me learning, the challenges that practitioners had in applying this standard and in the building industry in general.
And one of the committees that you worked on at that stage was the Environmental Health Committee, I believe.
Right. And as my research interests evolved, they were focused primarily on energy, but they grew into air quality issues. I then learned of the Environmental Health Committee and started to go to their meetings. And that was, I guess, probably in the late 80s. It was some of the leading in there are quality researchers in the world who, medical people and scientists who otherwise wouldn't have attended an ASHRAE meeting. They were there in some sense to serve as consultants to the society on environmental health issues. And it was very intimidating for me because I knew these were world famous people, and that was the first meeting I went to where they're making motions and amendments, and I'm like, wow, but I, over time I learned how to do that, and several years later I chaired the committee, and hopefully we got some good things done that year. And I think all of these activities that I participated in and these roles I assumed, just got me more comfortable. That transition from the periphery of the room to sitting at the head of the table and helping things happen.
And I guess at the table you became a DAL.
Right.
So that's a whole new world of activity, surely.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I didn't know what the board did. When I was chair of 62.1, I would go to board meetings just in case I would go to board meetings just in case something that we were putting forward for publication was a little bit controversial and questions arose. So I started to go to the board meetings and rarely had to say anything, but I think it was helpful at times. But when I became a DAL and I was assigned to
Director at large, of course.
Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't know what that meant until I was one. And I, was assigned to the ASHRAE Learning Institute. It was one of my roles, and one of the predecessors to, I think it was called Chapter Programs Committee then. I didn't know what the ALI was or what chapter programs were until I was put in those chairs. And it was great because I went to the Chapter Programs Committee and it was a whole room of people I had never met before doing things that I didn't know the society was doing. And I really enjoyed that experience. And that's, I think just a taste of my experience, and I'm sure the experience of others as a DAL, to just learn about things going on in the society that you didn't know about otherwise.
And from being a DAL, just a year or so later, you were elected Vice President of ASHRAE from 2007 to 2009.
Right.
And again, was that as much as a change as you've seen in the progression from a chair of a committee to director at large, and now to vice president? Yeah. Was that yet another major change in the way you saw ASHRAE?
I mean, at that, the vice president experience, which was just really a great experience, a great honor to serve that role. I just got the complete sense of what the society is doing and the relationships it's pursuing and all the activity almost on a day-to-day basis. Because by then we had plenty of email and I was getting it, and I just had this, it was just a great opportunity to find out how the society functioned and all the important things that were going on and to be part of it. I served as vice chair and then chair of Technology Council, which is where the TCs and the research and the standards happen. So I was familiar with that side, though, leading that council is a whole other thing than serving on the council. But all the other things that happen when you're an officer with the executive committee and, all the tough issues that they deal with, again, on a day-to-day basis was just a big eye-opening experience.
What were the major issues facing ASHRAE at that time?
I think, there were a few things happening. I think ASHRAE was trying to be more serious about its global commitments. We called ourselves an international society, but at that point, there were a variety of efforts were being pursued to make that more real, which led to all sorts of challenges and opportunities, as you know, to make that happen. So the whole global role of ASHRAE was a big issue. The other one was energy standards and where the energy standards were going and how much more stringent they would become over time. And and sustainability. What was ASHRAE's role in sustainability? And a lot was happening in the wider industry that some folks in ASHRAE feared or viewed as, that should be our issue. How come all these other people are, making this big splash with sustainability? We should be the sustainability people.
And was that a major shift, do you think, in ASHRAE's thinking process?
I think so. In some ways it was, in some ways it wasn't. I mean, we've been doing energy efficiency and indoor air quality and a lot of building sustainability issues for decades. But now there was this new label and this new green umbrella where the action was. It was exciting. Lots of people, especially younger people, are the future of the organization. And it was a real challenge for ASHRAE to kind of define their identity in that world. And like any big organization, ASHRAE doesn't move terribly quickly at times. But this was a field that was moving quickly, and we had to, try to be a bit more responsive than we might be otherwise, to be a player. So sustainability was another big issue facing society when I was an officer.
And as an officer, your prior experience or your prior training in teaching, does that come into useful practice in terms of helping your fellow board members to take on issues and develop themselves?
I hope so. I think explaining things to people in a way that they can understand it is a skill. And I'm not saying that I, necessarily very skillful in that area, but I understand. When you talk to people, they need to understand you. It's not about what you say; it's about what they hear. And when people start to get glazed over or look confused, you need to pick up on that and try to help them understand better. And I think, when I was doing my teacher training for children, I learned you got to have everything set up when those kids show up, because if you're fumfering around with the slides, they're gonna get distracted, and that's true about adults as well. You've got to be ready when you're speaking to children or adults, because if you're not, ready when the bell goes off and it's your turn to speak, they're going to get distracted. And so I think some of my teaching training was useful in speaking to my colleagues on the board and other venues.
Training's so important in ASHRAE. Has it always been a strength
of the society?
Yeah.
I think it's a mixed bag. Some very good training efforts occur, and others not so much. I mean, in my experience, specifically on the board, when I was trained to be a board member, it was just hours of PowerPoint. At the end of the day, we went to some stuffy restaurant and sat in a dark room for more hours, and it was just not that stimulating, I must admit. And then I had the opportunity to help train future board members some years later, and I kind of remembered, talked to some of my other colleagues who were involved in training, that we got to spice this up, limit the PowerPoint, sit in a circle and talk. And we didn't go to dinner in the back of a restaurant. We went bowling and had pizza, and it's, you're going to work with these people. And another thing I realized is when I got to the board and I went to that great big table, I didn't know who these people were. And it was very intimidating, and you feel very lost. And we, I think under Jeff Littleton's suggestion, we were starting to read these governance magazines about how nonprofit governing bodies work. And that reading that, reflecting on my experience, I realized, again, I didn't know who the board members were. And as part of the training, we had every board member write a one-page bio, which had photographs and a little story about their ASHRAE life and their personal life and their family. And we had all the existing board members do that, and then we had the incoming board members do that. And I don't know if that helped the board become a more human, socially interactive, positive experience for people, but I hope so. that you had some sense, and you found out you had some commonality outside of ASHRAE, and it was Sheila Hayter and I. We would have a little game. Who could come up with the most interesting. When you go around the introduction at the table at the beginning of a meeting. I'm Andy Persily. I work at the National Institute of Standards, and the same old thing. We would come up with interesting questions. Tell you who you are, where do you work, and who's the most famous person you met, or something like that. And it just, we're here to do work, but we're also here to have fun. And the relationships that you develop with your colleagues in society is one of the most positive aspects of my experience, and I think that's true of so many other people I talk to in ASHRAE. So enjoy it, get to know people, enjoy the people, and it's going to be good. It's going to make the work more fun and the whole experience more enjoyable.
Andy, what advice would you give to a young person who's thinking of entering the HVAC world?
One piece of advice, if I may be so bold, would be to find people, mentors, if you want to call it that, and peers that you can talk to, that you can relate to, ask questions. You'll get a sense of who you're comfortable with and who has something to offer. So when you go to committees, or whatever, or chapter meetings, find some people to talk to, and be a little bold. Get outside your comfort zone a little bit. You can, when you go to a chapter dinner, sit at a table with people you don't know, and that's hard. That's hard for me now, but it isn't that bad. You introduce yourself and you meet some interesting people, but finding people, mentors, peers that you can talk to, can be very helpful, because any fears or anxieties or questions you have, very likely they're having the same ones, and they can help you out. Get involved. This is not so much your work job, but your kind of ASHRAE opportunities to find a place for yourself. I've not met an ASHRAE committee that didn't need willing volunteers. Every committee is looking for a volunteer. If they don't know you, that's no issue. And all you have to do is tell them that I'm going to review and comment on this document in the next month, and then actually do it. And you will be a hero. That's all you got to do is commit, follow through, and that's all. That's a big start, and is very much appreciated. And you will get jobs. You'll get more jobs than you probably want. So you also have to learn to say no. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't have time, it's much better to say no, I don't have time, than say yes when you don't have time. Another similar is measuring ventilation rates and comparing them to the design ventilation rates. People spend a lot of money designing ventilation systems to bring air into the building, and that's very important. But once they're installed, commissioned, operated, maintained, or not maintained, how much air is actually being brought into the building? And these measurements can be very challenging at times, but that's why you spend all that money on that ventilation system. You really ought to check on how much air is coming in. So I think that's kind of an overall thrust that I've pursued, is building performance measurement relative to design intent, because there is often a gap. And when I was on 62.1, I often said, remember, we're all assuming there's a connection between what we write in the standard and what happens in the building, and that isn't always a one-to-one correspondence. So I think those are some of the technical areas I like to think I had an impact on. In terms of the kind of the process on Standard 62.1 and the Indoor Air Quality Design Guide and other committee activities to produce something, I'd like to think I contributed towards kind of taking a very, in some cases, tumultuous situation on 62.1 and kind of managing the opinions and the energies to move people forward towards actually revising that standard so that it was fully in code language and addressed, some of the key issues that we're facing the industry in the field of ventilation and indoor air quality. So I like to think that I was able to, manage diverse viewpoints and valid, technical issues and help this smart group of people get to the other side and finish, produce a product that was useful to people.
And you've got a fantastic experience in indoor air quality and the drivers that determine our internal environment.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see future problems or future challenges in indoor air quality?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. I in this day of, energy efficiency, fighting for energy efficiency, it's so important because of the limited resource and concerns about climate change and other environmental impacts of building energy use. We need to remember that buildings don't exist to use less energy. Buildings exist for people to work, to learn, to heal, to enjoy life. And we need to remember that. Now, that said, we have to reduce the amount of energy that buildings use, and we may need to, think about indoor air quality in different ways, or thermal comfort. What are our targets? And I think in the case of thermal comfort, we may need to be a little more flexible in the temperature ranges and the clothing that people wear to work, so that they can be comfortable there, comfortable and productive, and still use less energy. The difference in the application of the difference in the application of air conditioning in North America compared to the rest of the world, the room temperatures in North America compared to the rest of the world, I think just has to be addressed in terms of the cultural expectations. I think probably need to be relaxed a bit in North America, because we can't cool the entire world buildings to 70 degrees. It's not necessary, and we probably can't afford it. But we need to figure out that balance between, the indoor environment and the energy consumption. And it isn't an either or. We need to do both.
Andy, thanks very much for giving up your time today. This has been an excellent opportunity to hear your viewpoint and your experiences of being a Vice President of ASHRAE.
Well, I've really enjoyed it. I mean, it gave me the opportunity to kind of reflect a little bit, which we don't always take the time to do. So I thank you for inviting me to participate in this.